Hello, I'm Kayleen Johnson-Sullivan, here to have a conversation with Dan L. Walker about the benefits and perils of writing about family. Is it best to write family stories as fiction or nonfiction? He's done both, and we look forward to hearing his perspective. Dan grew up in the second youngest of 7 children. He was 5 years old when his parents headed north from Sugar Tree Ridge, Ohio, to build a homestead on Alaska's Kenai Peninsula. Dan's early years in Happy Valley shaped his life, and he wrote about those experiences in his novel, Secondhand Summer, and published by Alaska Northwest Books in 2016, and his memoir, Letters from Happy Valley, published in 2018 by Ember Press. This is a presentation for Alaska Book Week 2020. And both of Dan's novel and his memoir reflect on life and family in very different ways. He has a novel forthcoming in 2021, a sequel to Secondhand Summer called Back Home. Dan, welcome. Today we're going to have 2 readings, and then we'll have some questions afterwards. Welcome, Dan.
Thank you. I thought I would begin with a reading from Secondhand Summer because it's the first book I wrote. And it came about when I was getting started as a writer. And this story had always been in my mind because I grew up on a homestead on the Kenai Peninsula, and I thought I was living in heaven because I was living in a log cabin with a big family, and I really loved that life. And then when I was a young teenager, my father died, and we had to leave the homestead and move to Anchorage where my mom could find work. And I went through a major lifestyle change in that pivotal summer. And that's where Secondhand Summer came from. And I thought I would read an excerpt from when we first arrive in Anchorage when we're making the move. It's from chapter 4. On the last day of May, the Bargers drove down Hollywood Drive to our new home in the Hollywood Arms Apartments. Unfortunately, Hollywood Drive in Anchorage, Alaska had no resemblance to the Hollywood that the rest of the world knew about. Ours was one of dozens of 2-story apartment buildings scattered like Monopoly hotels on Government Hill across Ship Creek from downtown Anchorage. Our neighborhood was on the bluff above the railroad yard and 2 blocks from the Elmendorf Air Force Base. Hollywood Drive seemed, even to a bush kid, to be in the middle of nowhere, going nowhere. We parked in front of Hollywood Arms and started unloading the car. Mary complained as soon as Mom was out of earshot. You notice nobody asked what we wanted? This place is a dump. I can just imagine what the kids are like. It's not so bad, I said. Not so bad. When you get to be my age, Humpy, you'll be more particular. Peeling paint the color of chicken vomit, dirty broken windows, it's a dump. So it's pretty yucky. Well, orphans don't get many choices, I said. Oh, lose the drama, Sam, we're not orphans. Want to bet? Don't start that. Orphans go to orphanages or get adopted because they don't have parents, you moron. I think if you look, Mom's in the kitchen cleaning cupboards. I'll find the dictionary and show you as soon as we get unpacked. And I did too. I showed her in the dictionary that a child who loses one parent can also be called an orphan. Well, you'll see, Humpy, orphan or not, when you go to school next year, you won't be the tallest kid or the fastest runner or anything. You'll just be another stupid freshman in a big school. And I'll be that girl that nobody knows or wants to know. She stomped off with a pair of boxes and disappeared through the dirty green door that led to our new home. The sky was suddenly full of noise, and I looked up to see a trio of fighter jets roar in low to land at the Air Force Base. It was amazing to see real jets flying just above my head, like the ones in the model airplane boxes. It wasn't long, though, after the flash and the roar, that the ribbons of exhaust across the sky became just part of the incessant noise. Distant thunder behind the storm of cars, kids, and trains. Our new home was a 2-bedroom apartment on the 2nd floor. 5 rooms with white walls, a kitchen with an electric stove, a complete bathroom glistening with porcelain and chrome, 2 bedrooms, and a living room with windows that opened to let the musty air escape. My room had a view of gravel and potholes of the parking lot. Beyond that was the natural hedge of cottonwoods and alders along the bluff, and beyond that, the screech, chug, and whistle of the railroad yards that carried a hint of mystery and adventure. There were no room for snares or trap lines, no snug hummocks where a boy could hide and daydream. But I had to admit that back home we didn't have railroads, fighter jets, or playgrounds. Luckily, for the time being, the excitement of newness had me forgetting the leaving part of moving. I had 3 boxes piled on the bed. One was jeans, t-shirts, and underwear that I sorted into the bottom drawer of a metal refugee from an army barracks. It matched the single metal bed that took up most of the space. The room was small, but it was mine. It was the first time I'd have a room of my own. In the coming months, it would become a refuge for all the things that weren't. The other boxes were the important ones. One was a black label beer case. The bottom was reinforced with tape and packed so full of comics that I barely made it up the stairs without a rest. Half of the comics made a neat stack on the corner of the bureau, and the rest went under the bed. One box remained, a Smirnoff vodka case with bottles dividers in place. One by one, I removed the models I'd packed in newspaper, rolled slowly, rolling the paper out in my hand like these were the last Christmas gifts under the tree. Each one had an importance that extended beyond the value of plastic models that had been glued and painted piece by piece. There had been tough choices when I packed my things into Milchick. Mom gave me 1 box for my books and models, and I'd have to sort through the boxes of treasures to find pieces that meant something that would help me remember. Everything else went in 2 other boxes, one to give away and one to be stored in the attic of the cabin to wait for a day when I would return. I can only believe that this was all just temporary. The plastic models that made the cut were a Ford station wagon, an X-15 rocket plane, and a Corvette convertible. The others were glue-stained or missing parts, so I put them on the closet shelf. The X-15 and the 65 Corvette I lined up on the windowsill. The Corvette was from Becky when she drew my name for the class gift exchange, and I kept it to help me remember her. The rocket plane had been a birthday gift from Dad, the last gift from him, I realized. Now all I had were these pieces of plastic and paint and the strange sick feeling when I thought of them. The Ford station wagon with the wood trim was just like the car we had taken Dad to the hospital in when he had his first heart attack. When I set it in place on the bureau, a new place in a new room, I felt a warm knot in my throat. Once settled into an apartment, it became a home without a mother. Every day, Mom was up by 5, showered and sitting at the table with a cup of coffee in her robe, looking out the window before she dressed and caught the bus downtown. She worked at the big hotel there. She was a waitress till 3, then a hostess or cashier until closing time. Most nights she didn't get home until 10. By then, she wanted her sippin' and slippers, a short glass of whiskey and her sheepskin slippers. With those 2 comforts and a kiss from her kids, she would sleep on the couch until it was starting to start again. There was no more fresh bread in the house, no stew with dumplings. The mother I'd had for all these years moved out and left her twin. This was a mother at work, going to work, home from work, or tired from work. She didn't make jelly and she bought Wonder Bread. Mary and I had a list of chores for each day, including cleaning and laundry, until finally Mary admitted we had become orphans. I determined to get along by doing anything I chose for as long as I could undisturbed. I daydreamed and read my comics and Mickey Spillane detective novels. I inherited Mickey Spillane from Joe, who didn't think I'd understand them, but I did. And Spillane wrote stories about tough guy detective, kind of urban Tarzans taking on the rough jungle of the city life. My 3rd Sunday in Anchorage, I lay with my feet propped up on the windowsill and one of Spillane's books under my nose. I was using up an afternoon helping Mike Hammer track a high society killer. Mom was running the vacuum up and down the hall in her weekend ritual of cleaning everything in the apartment. She was in her Sunday jeans and a sweatshirt that she changed into after what Mary and I called church shopping. We'd been to 3 different churches in a month and she still hadn't settled on one that fit her philosophy. This week she had walked out shaking her head. "What Bible has he been reading?" she asked in disgust. Mary and I just nodded and looked at each other. Mom shut off the vacuum long enough to shout down the hall to me, but I pretended not to hear. Then her footsteps came to my room. She didn't share my literary convictions, so Spillane went under the bed and out came a book called Touchdown Trouble, a sports story more to Mom's approval. She rapped on the door and followed that in. She leaned on the door jamb and glared. "Go meet some kids in the neighborhood," she said. "You'll never make friends sitting here with your nose in a book." I think I'll stop there. I chose that selection because it tried to show the transition that the character experienced and I experienced when I moved to Anchorage. And this book came about because I wanted to write a book for my students, because I was teaching middle school at the time, and I wanted a book that boys would want to write and could connect with. And that's kind of how it got started.
That's great, Dan. Were you going to read another selection from your other book, from Letters from Happy Valley?
Yes, I will. And Letters from Happy Valley, which Kayleen helped me publish, and we came up with this. Her wonderful book designer developed a cover that I still love grabbing onto. And this is a kind of the prequel to Secondhand Summer, in that it's a family memoir that tells about the experience of my family moving from Ohio to Alaska when I was 5 years old for the great homestead adventure, as some people like to think of it. And this book came about not from my memory, but from my parents' letters. We found a box of letters that had been in my grandmother's closet for 50 years. And they were complete letters that my parents started writing literally the day we left Ohio in 1958, and writing back to my grandmother and grandfather. And they were a great discovery for me, because being 5 years old, my memory was very limited on that experience. So I took my parents' letters and wrapped my writing around them to create, to tell that story. And I'm going to read from the beginning of, early in the beginning when we had just left Ohio, and tell a little bit about our family to introduce them. A photo taken probably only days before we left shows a lean and tan family stretched across a living room couch. The faces are full of hope and optimism, perhaps even then looking forward to that day when we would break the bonds of family and community to take the road north. There were 8 of us walkers. Chester, James, and Jeanette were married December 8, 1941, and 10 months later, the babies started arriving. First came Thomas Chester, the oldest, biggest, and as firstborn, he held all the cards. Then Michael James, with poor eyesight out in front of a brilliant, rebellious mind. William Franklin was next, in the tough position of being third behind 2 brothers, who would always be bigger and faster and first. Bill was to become the lover boy of the family, the dude. Finally, along came a girl, Amy Sue. And like most girls at that time in that part of the country, she wasn't just Amy, she was Amy Sue. She was the oldest of the younger half of the family, for it seems our family was actually 2 units, the boys and the young'uns, with Amy in the lead and Peggy Ann just 2 years after Amy. They were close from day one, a mismatched set of salt and pepper shakers. Amy was small and raven-haired, playfully serious, and Peggy was tall and blonde, very seriously playful. I remember them always together and usually with me in hand. I was the last of the Walkers born in Ohio. I arrived weighing over 10 pounds in a mid-April snowstorm, as if even then I was meant for the North Country. I try to imagine what that day was like when we loaded up and left Sugar Tree Ridge. Was it windy or rainy? Had the heat and humidity of summer come by then? Did family and friends turn out to wave goodbye, or did we rise early and drive quietly north? Were we all looking back out the rear windows and rearview mirrors for one last look at the tiny hamlet with the storybook name? I can only think it was an early day with people too excited to sleep, ready for the road, but finding it so hard to leave. With a little research, I discovered that it was a hot day, and in fact, June 5, 1958 was a record-setting 88 degrees. Traveling with us was the Butler family, a couple with 2 children who were friends of ours. Tom Butler and Dad had gone in partners to buy a 2-ton truck and a generator. Tom's oldest son, Dennis, was a friend of my brother Tom. Like us, they were breaking the bonds with Ohio and turning their dream north to the great unknown. What feelings must have arisen in that silence of those first nights on the road, with home not far behind, but at the same time so far away, and a road out front long and unknown. But there was still the comfort those first nights of fried chicken and all the fixins at the end of a long day of driving. For these were people harvested from the deep soil of the heartland, and their traditions and perceptions traveled with them. They were farmers who saw the world through the eyes of planters and sowers, breeders and husbanders, tillers of the soil. Both of my parents had ancestors who pioneered the legendary Ohio Valley when it was home to the Shawnee and the Miami people. Back then it was known as the Western Frontier. The progenitors of the Walkers came through the Cumberland Gap with Daniel Boone and helped build the Wilderness Road. Generations lived and died in Highland and Clinton counties, filling whole cemeteries, some of them so full of dead Walkers that they carried that surname. On my mother's side, across the Ohio River in eastern Kentucky, roots were just as deep. In the decades after the Revolutionary War, the Barger, Bowling, and Eversole roots of the family made the journey from Virginia and North Carolina to build towns and traditions in the wild land of Kentucky. Through the last centuries, the American frontier had continuously moved west and north. And when the country was young, the Ohio Valley was the frontier. Then it moved to west of the Mississippi, then to the Rockies, California, and Oregon. What lay beyond was the northern border of the United States, and beyond that was the next frontier, shrouded in mystery and shadow. And now, for the first time in more than a century, a branch of the family was leaving the heartland to pioneer the new frontier, a place so distant that even until World War II, it was completely off the mental map of most Americans. For our caravan of would-be homesteaders and the people we were leaving behind, even Minnesota and Wisconsin were considered distant lands. Alaska must have seemed at the end of the earth, a place out on the edge of the known world and far beyond the familiar, an exotic place like Timbuktu or Shangri-La. It was the far frontier, and the Walkers were going to find it. At the time, I imagined that, I'm sorry, I lost my place. I don't need letters to tell me the mix of dread, loss, and eagerness that must have hung in the air on those first days on the road. Tom and Mike, both teenagers at the time, were not happy to leave their rich social lives and go traipsing over the horizon with no company but their younger brothers and sisters. Who would? Mike was madly in love with a preacher's daughter at the time, and Tom was deep into baseball. Surely they were sulking and resentful when their broken hearts ached as we drove away from Sugar Tree Ridge. Bill, Amy, and Peggy would also have friends to whom they were saying a farewell. They were all leaving an Ohio full of pals and cousins and church groups, ball teams and girlfriends, and I'm sure they swore that love affairs and friendships would carry on through the mail. Who could believe that people we treasured would eventually fade in our memories, and that down the road we would find new friends long before the ones we left behind did the same. I imagine my father and I were eager and excited. He was pursuing a dream, and I was leaving a different Ohio for my brothers and sisters. For them, leaving meant going away from everything to a place that had nothing. But for 5-year-old me, in the center of a circle formed by mom, dad, brothers, and sisters, everything that was important was going with us. And I'll read one short letter from my father here to give you a taste of that. June 8th, 1958. Dear Mom and Pop, we're camped at a state park in northwest Minnesota, right on the shore of a lake about like Rocky Fork. It was raining awful hard when we pulled in here yesterday evening, but it quit in a little while. We've traveled about 950 miles already, have had 2 flat tires on the pickup, and a fuel pump went out. That's all the trouble we had. Wisconsin is a mess of resorts and not very pretty for the most part, but we spent the night in Bigfoot Forest State Park at Black River Falls and Thursday night at Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. We figure to make Grand Forks, North Dakota tomorrow. The campgrounds are real nice and the people are nice too. The fishing here must be pretty good, but you have to use a boat to really get them. 2 fellows caught 200 crappies yesterday. Minnesota is a wet and boggy place, and the corn is almost as big as the weeds and the grass around it. The crops behind are down there. They do lots of strip farming here, corn, oats, and hay all in the same field. And we've seen lots of Holstein cattle all the way up. They still have one-room schoolhouses up here. And the traffic has been awful heavy up till yesterday, but after we got around St. Paul and Minneapolis, it slowed down, so driving was pretty good. The kids are doing very well and seem to be enjoying every bit of it. Well, I hope this finds you well as usual and about to go fishing myself, so long for now. We'll write soon, Chet. I thought you'd like to hear a little bit of my father's voice. His voice and my mother's voice were very strong, and their letters tell a really engaging story with lots of details about routine life told with a lot of humor.
Thank you, Dan. I agree that the voice of your dad and the voice of you, I guess you came by your writing naturally, as far as he was, his letters are full of details. And it seems to me that writing about family can be kind of a perilous endeavor. And I'm just wondering how you decided to write Secondhand Summer as a novel, and then later to write the memoir as a nonfiction.
Well, when I wrote Secondhand Summer, it came about partially from telling my wife about that transitional summer and thinking about writing it down. But this was 40 years after the fact, and it was hard to engage all the details to really fill it out. And so I was torn between telling a story that didn't have a lot of detail or making up parts. And so I decided that why not make it a novel? And that way you had the freedom of bringing in characters, creating details that you don't remember, but at the same time, telling the core of the story of what it was like that I went through. And once I kind of let my mind accept that, then I was able to create a family that was a little bit different than my family. And I gave the character a different name. I called the character Sam Barger, which is, Barger is my grandmother's maiden name. And I then made the family a little bit different. For example, Sam in the story only has one brother and a sister, which makes a story a little more manageable to tell, because having 6 siblings in a story like this would make lots of personalities to manage and not really add that much to the story, because the story is really about a young adolescent dealing with the death of his father and moving to a completely different lifestyle and leaving a lifestyle behind that he really cherished. And so for me, it's about storytelling. And that kind of personal storytelling kind of comes in 3 different forms. You can write an autobiography, which tells your whole life. And usually that's only meaningful if you're famous enough that people want to hear about your whole life. And then there's memoir, where you take a piece of your life and write about it. And I didn't have enough detail, I felt like, to really give that justice. But writing autobiographical fiction allows the author to tell their story, but to also create a setting and create characters that help the arc of the story flow and be a little more engaging. When you do that, I think you're obligated at the same time to tell a story that's true to the time, because it is historical fiction, so that people can look at 1965 and say, that's what it was like in Anchorage, Alaska, because Dan knew what he was talking about. And it also tells a story that people want to follow and connect with, because the connection is really important in any kind of writing like this, that the reader can find a connection with that, some challenge they face, some transition that they've gone through. As far as Letters from Happy Valley, I was able to write that as a memoir, not because of my incredible memory, because in fact it goes farther back in my family, but I was able to blend 2 or 3 different things. One, I had my personal memory, which was really limited. And as I say in the book, they're kind of like little postcards from my life that I can remember these little pieces. But I had this box of letters from my parents that basically told a year-long narrative from June of 1958, well, more like 7 months or so, up through January of 1959, they had 3 and 4 page letters written several times a week. So I had this great resource to tell this story. And then I also had my 2 sisters that I could go to help me flesh out the story. And then there was research where you go online and find things out, like what was the weather like on June 5th, 1958. And all that made it possible to put together a book that really told a story of a time and a family and that experience, with a lot of real life detail.
Thank you, Dan. Did you run your books by family before you published? Was that something that was a consideration for you?
A little bit. I use family as a resource, and I told them about what I was doing. For instance, Secondhand Summer, I got a lot of encouragement from family because I was kind of the writer in the family, to take that and do that. And at first we talked about just publishing just the letters, but I wanted to do more than that, and to tell my story wrapped around it. And part of that story was figuring out who my dad was, because my dad died when I was 11, and I knew my dad more as the stories that I was told about him by my brothers and sisters and my mom. And I wanted to know more. And his letters so this book is partially an exploration of that, me looking for my father in his letters and my mom's letters and that. When I wrote Secondhand Summer, I had only one sister in the story, and I tried to think about, well, what kind of character would she be? And I kind of blended personality traits of my 2 sisters. And I was curious, probably most curious, about how they would react, whether they would felt they were left out or whether they would felt I was doing them wrong. But they both really liked the sister, and I think they both thought that they were the sister I was writing about. As far as, I think when you write memoir, depending on the kind of memoir you write, you do run the risk of alienating people. And I did that maybe not with family, but with the people who traveled up the highway with us, because after the book was published, a member of the Butler family that traveled up the highway with us contacted me, and I think she hadn't read the book yet, and she was excited to read the book. And she said, I was one of the family that traveled up the Alaska highway with you. And we had lost contact with them decades ago. And I kind of wondered what her reaction would be, because in fact, my parents don't speak very fondly of this family by the time we get to Alaska because it was they were discontent when they got to Alaska and didn't stay very long. And they turned around and went home, which was, as I write in the book, was probably a good choice for them because they weren't happy. So I kind of was anxious about, well, I wonder how she feels about the book after she read it. And I haven't heard from her, so apparently she wasn't too excited.
So what was most challenging about writing either of those two books, and how did you overcome that challenge?
I think, well, there are lots of challenges in writing. In Secondhand Summer, it was more the challenge of creating a good story arc and getting good engaging language and characters that worked for the kind of audience I was writing for. So to me, it was more of a typical writing challenge as if I was writing a fiction book. And I think partially because I really liked the topic I was writing about, and there wasn't a lot of family tension in it or anything. The Secondhand Summer was a challenge because, in a lot of ways, because in a way there was so much I wanted to say, but you want to say it in an engaging way and make it tie into the book well. There was also a need to do research because even though I had my parents' letters and I had family members to draw on, there's always lots of research you have to do to get specific details right, like about the geography of the Kenai Peninsula. What was the Alaska Highway like in 1958? The other challenge was that was kind of a surprise to me was the mismatch of memory, because there were things I remembered that didn't match with what my parents were saying, and my parents were writing events as they happened, so there wasn't really any reason to argue with them. For instance, one of the events that I remembered from going up the highway, which was probably just 2 or 3 things, was we got to go see this display of the Mounties riding their horses in their fancy uniforms, and it was a really cool mounted cavalry performance that I remembered really distinctly. And that happened in a completely different place than I remembered it. And some research proved that I was wrong and my parents were right about where that happened. And there was another memory that I had of an accident where we had a gas-operated wringer washing machine, these great big behemoth things that were big as a modern refrigerator. And they would agitate the clothes, and then you'd run the clothes through a wringer that pressed the water out of them. And I had this memory of us doing a big laundry and one of the teenage girls getting her fingers caught in the wringer, and which would be a very painful and scary experience. And it was a real vivid memory of mine. And it doesn't appear in any of my parents' letters. And when I talked to my sister about it, who has a really good memory, she had no recollection of that at all. So it's one of those things where it's like, where did I get that? So memory is really tricky that way. And as a matter of fact, I went down the rabbit hole of reading about how memory works when I was working on the books. And there's a lot of writing about that, how we distort memory and that we think we remember things really well. And in fact, if you sit down with a group of people, you find that memories don't always match. We're not all as good eyewitnesses as we think we are. So that was a real challenge.
That's fascinating, Dan. I think that whole notion of memory and how we write and what we write about and what we remember is just really interesting. So we're running a little short on time, so I wondered if you would tell us a little bit about your next book that's coming up.
Yes, Back Home is the sequel to Secondhand Summer, and Secondhand Summer takes place when the summer before Sam is going into high school. And after I wrote it, I got to thinking, okay, well, what's next for Sam? Sam as a character, and not just telling more about my life, but also what might happen to this character. And his brother Joe is a real important character in the book as an older brother who's going out on his own and at the same time is trying to be part of the family. And my brother Bill was very much kind of the model for Joe, although there were pieces of my other brothers in him. And my brother Bill went off to Vietnam and was as a Marine and was heavily involved in a lot of major battles in Vietnam. And he suffered PTSD, although we didn't call it that. And he had a very rough life after Vietnam. And when I was at the same time, I was in high school and I was the other end of the spectrum. I was an anti-war kid, and we used to have these long arguments about the war in our family. And I was very anti-war, and here was my brother who was coming back as a wounded hero. Back home, I embedded that in a story about Sam and his brother Joe having that experience and the challenge of how do you keep family when politics gets in the way. And also embedded in there is a bit of adventure when the brothers go moose hunting together as a way of trying to rekindle some of the family bond. So they have an adventure in there as well.
Well, it sounds like a very appropriate book for the times. And we're looking forward to reading that when it comes available, probably in April, right?
Yes, comes out in April 2021.
Well, Dan, thanks so much for your readings and reflections today. I'm going to share a screen here with some information about how to get more information about your books.
Thank you.
There's some of the pictures that you'll find in his book, Letters from Happy Valley. And this is just such a great picture. This one on the right, the little boy in the dad's lap is Dan. So you can see the resemblance. There's some more family pictures. We want to thank the Alaska Center for the Book for hosting the Alaska Book Week. Thanks to Dan Walker for readings and reflections today. Thanks to Ember Press for sponsoring the video. And here's some more information on those books, Letters from Happy Valley and Secondhand Summer. These are available from independent booksellers online and wherever books are sold. And there at the bottom of the screen is a website for Dan L. Walker. If you'd like to contact him, order books from him, or continue this conversation. So thanks again, Dan. Looking forward to reading your next book, and have a good day.
Thank you very much. And thanks to Alaska Reads and Alaska Book Week.